Robert the Doll. He's known around the world, having amassed an army of devoted fans and allegedly terrified victims. He currently sits behind a UV and humidity controlled display case in the Fort East Martello Museum in Key West, Florida. A display case that was bought for him by one of his followers. But how did Robert the Doll become one of the most famous haunted dolls in the world? And why does he receive thousands of letters of apology from people who have wronged him every single year? So as you walk through the Fort East Martello Museum, you can learn about the history of the island itself, its roles in different conflicts, what manufacturing industries the area was known for. It seems like a very informative place. But without a doubt, the star of the show and the exhibit that an overwhelming number of visitors arrive specifically to see is a doll from the early 1900s named Robert. He's 3 feet tall, made of a wire frame and stuffed with like a very fine wood wool, also known as Excelsior stuffing, which was very popular for stuffing things like teddy bears. He's seen wearing a sailor suit and holding his own toy, which looks to be a lion that the museum staff have taken to calling Leo. And his face looks just like what you would imagine a doll from the early 1900s would look, after decades of being a child's best friend for years. He has little black buttons for eyes, his face is covered in little nicks, almost like scars, and one of his ears is missing. But it's thought that Robert the Doll didn't always look like this, because he may not have actually been intended as a toy. Robert was manufactured by the Steiff Company, which was the same company that first created the teddy bear in honor of President Theodore Roosevelt. And a Steiff historian basically came out and said that it's likely that Robert was originally created to be a window display, and that he may have originally been wearing a pink and green jester outfit. But there are a few theories as to how the German manufactured Robert eventually came to be the best friend of a boy who lived in Key West, called Robert Eugene Otto, in about 1904. Some sources say that Otto's grandfather, a doctor called Joseph, gave the doll to his grandson after a trip to Germany. But this doesn't look likely, as Robert the Doll came into Robert the boy's life definitely sometime around 1904, while Joseph actually passed away from a fall in 1885, so before his grandson was even born, because Robert Eugene Otto was born in 1900. Others believe that because the Ottos had family in Germany, and we have records of gifts being exchanged across the Atlantic between the two sides of the family, that Robert the Doll was one of these gifts from the German Ottos. There's also a theory that Robert the Doll was a loving gift to the little 4-year-old boy, given to him by one of the servants who worked for the Ottos. But considering how it looks to be that Robert the Doll was never intended to be an actual child's doll, and would have had to have been shipped over from Germany at some point in the very early 1900s, both points that would have made Robert an incredibly expensive purchase, that seems unlikely. And I'm also going to point out and draw attention to something here as well, because in none of the resources I came across while I was putting together this story did anyone refer to the staff employed by the Ottos as anything other than servants. However, I think it is a very important point to make here that we are talking very early 1900s, and we're talking about a very affluent family who lived in Florida's Key West. Slavery was officially abolished in 1865, and so I believe that's the reason why they're being referred to as servants. But even after the passing of the 13th Amendment, some slaves did just continue working for their masters, albeit now for possibly whatever passed for a wage. That's not written anywhere in the sources I used. I'm just kind of reading between the lines here. It's an important thing to highlight in the context of history at that time, so just something to bear in mind, because there is a story less about the actual origins of how Robert the Doll came to Key West, but more providing a potential explanation for what happened afterwards. Because after Robert the Doll was given to Robert Otto, the pair became inseparable. So much so that Robert Otto started demanding to be referred to by his middle name, Gene, short for Eugene, so that his doll could go by his first name, Robert. And that's how Robert the Doll got his name, and from then on, Robert Eugene went by just Gene, which I guess could be seen as fairly innocent. Kids become obsessed with specific toys when they're young. I was a huge fan of soft toys. I had a huge collection when I was a kid. I had a lamb from when I was born, a teddy bear from Asda that Dad gave to me to shut up crying while we were doing the food shop, and that I fell so madly in love with that they had to buy him for me. And then there was also Rainbow and Hare and Charlotte the horse. I had loads. But it seems to be more than that for Gene and Robert, as we will see later. And so some people believe that voodoo is involved, because the story goes that Gene, I'm going to be calling him Gene from now on. His grandfather Joseph, he employed a servant, a man from the Bahamas called William Abbott. Again, he's only mentioned as a servant. By all accounts from that time, they had a seemingly good working relationship. They both respected and cared for each other. And after Joseph's death in 1885, one of his sons, Thomas Otto, who was actually Jean Otto's father, he hired William to work as a clerk in his drugstore because, like his father, Thomas was a doctor. The story goes that after he had hired William, Thomas actually began having an affair with William's wife, Emmeline, and she fell pregnant with his kid, but the child passed away not long afterwards. There's no actual evidence that comes right out and said they had an affair and Emmeline gave birth to his baby, but the stack of circumstantial evidence kind of leaves you to believe that that is what happened, as Emmeline filed a lawsuit against the Otto family. Also, Jean's mother, so Thomas's wife Minnie, there are apparently journal entries from her, as well as the fact that she specifically requested to not be buried in the Otto family plot after she died. Like, didn't want anything to do with the Otto family, even after her death. Like, that's a pretty big deal. And so where Robert the Doll comes into this little side story is that some people claim that after Emmeline lost her baby, she performed some sort of voodoo ritual on Robert the Doll to contain the child's spirit within this doll. Other people think that there was no voodoo involved, and that because Robert the Doll does resemble a young child, being 3 feet tall, that the child's spirit attached itself to the doll, and that maybe that's what Jean was sensing, what he was picking up on. And then there are some people that do believe that there is something going on, but there's a little bit more of a logical explanation behind it, and that maybe Jean at some point heard the rumours about his dad, he knew about what happened to his half-sibling, and the poor kid's like no older than 4 or 5 at this point, so he's thinking about his half-sibling that he never got to meet, and so it was the power of his thoughts and belief that gave Robert the Doll this power, which I can kind of follow along with that logic. I'm a big believer in the notion that giving something thought gives it power, but let me know what you think, what your thoughts are, because however Robert the Doll came into the Otto's household at 534 Eaton Street, and whether there truly was anything going on, any voodoo, paranormal attachment, manifestation, anything, the fact is that Jean and his doll, Robert, were inseparable. At some point, Jean switched out Robert's jester outfit for his sailor suit, which I actually think used to be worn by Jean himself, and so that just gives you kind of like an idea of the size of Robert compared to Jean back in those early days. And Robert went everywhere with him. They did everything together. Jean even referred to Robert in the first person. Like, he was a real person. He wasn't just a doll. He was Robert. Which, yeah, at first, is cute. This young boy had a great friend in Robert. Eventually, though, as Jean grew older, it took a bit of a turn. If Jean misbehaved, if, say, a lamp ended up smashed on the floor, either by accident or on purpose, and Jean was questioned about it, his immediate response would be, I didn't do it, Robert did it. And this escalated until every single little thing that went wrong in Jean's life was Robert's fault. Robert did it. Which, I mean, technically, is not wrong. Jean is Robert, but he's obviously referring to Robert the Doll. Which, I don't know, it kind of does make me think that maybe there is something to that emotion that Jean was projecting onto Robert. That they were one and the same person. But it got weirder. When Jean's parents, Minnie and Thomas, would just so happen to be walking past Jean's room, they would hear their son talking and giggling in his room, obviously talking to Robert the Doll, who else would he be talking to? But they would also hear a second voice, talking back to Jean. Apparently this voice was in no way similar to Jean's. It allegedly didn't sound like Jean had made up a voice for Robert or anything like that, and it just struck them as very strange. But it didn't all seem to be the perfect friendship between a boy and his doll. One night, Minnie and Thomas were woken up by Jean's screams in the middle of the night. They rushed into his room where they found Jean thrashing and struggling on the floor, screaming out, trying to pin Robert down onto the floor for some unknown reason. But that morning, they would be back to seemingly the best of friends again. But as Jean grew older, he wasn't a kid anymore and he had to start living his life. He eventually moved away and left Robert at home. He studied architecture at the University of Virginia. He attended the Academy of Fine Arts in Chicago. He worked with instructors at the Art Students League in New York City, after which he moved to Paris to set up his own studio. And it was here where he met his wife, Annette Parker, but she called herself Anne. At some point after the couple married, they moved back to Jean's childhood home in Key West. And pretty much immediately, Jean and Robert became inseparable again. Anne doesn't appear to have been a huge fan of Robert. She was pretty alarmed to see that Robert had his own room set up in the attic, filled with child-sized furniture, and was even more alarmed when her husband would spend more and more time in the company of Robert and Robert alone. Jean was still an artist, that was how he made a living. Like, the whole house even now is referred to as the artist's house because of Jean Otto. And so he set his studio up in one of the rooms, where he would prop Robert up near one of the windows so that he could be in the same room as him while he worked. And he would spend hours locked away with just his childhood doll for company while he worked. Apparently at this time, school children who would walk by would look up at this particular window and would allegedly see Robert move from one side of the window to the other. There was also taught that the longer Jean and Anne lived at 534 Eaton Street, the worse Jean's attitude towards his wife got. This is allegedly based on stories from people who were close to Anne. There were rumours that Jean was physically abusive towards Anne, but that doesn't appear to be the case. However, there does seem to be a bit of what we would probably now see as emotional and verbal abuse. As an example, Anne was a very talented pianist, but Jean would refuse to let her play anywhere outside of their home as he didn't want her overshadowing him as the big important artist. And if Anne dusted and didn't put everything back exactly how it had been, he would berate her about it. He'd even make her wait outside of any public event they went to for at least 5 minutes, so the attention would be on him when he arrived. As time went on, it seems like Jean may have turned more and more cold towards his wife, and it said that whenever he was confronted about how he was treating Anne, he would reply with the same thing he used to say when he was a kid. I didn't do it, Robert did it. In the final few years of his life, Jean would spend more and more of his time up in the attic talking with Robert all day, until 1974 when Jean passed away, aged 74. After her husband died, Anne said that she was sure that Robert the doll had been the only friend Jean had ever truly had in his life. The newspaper obituary announcing Jean's death referenced a long illness, which we eventually learned through family documents was actually Parkinson's. And it's interesting to note that one of the symptoms that some people with advanced Parkinson's can develop is delusional psychosis. So could it have been with Jean spending all of his time in the attic with Robert that he was hallucinating because of his Parkinson's? Or was it just a man getting comfort out of spending time with a friend that he's had almost his entire life? Once Jean passed away though, there was no love lost between Anne and Robert the doll, and so she demanded that he stay in the attic and he needs to be locked in the cedar chest that once held all of his different outfits. And here it gets a little murky from what I can gather. Anne moved out of the artist's house and went to Boston, Massachusetts to live with her sister. She rented out the artist's house, but she actually had it put in the lease contract that Robert had to remain in the attic. No one was allowed up there. Don't even go up for a nosebag. That's Robert's room. Don't even think about it. 2 guys who rented the house, they were initially like weirdly specific, but fine, we can roll with that. But as they lived in this house, they would hear what sounded like a child giggling up in the attic. Other times it would sound like there was someone up there rummaging around. One day the sounds were just getting a bit much. It really sounds like we've got a roommate living up here not paying rent, you know? So they ventured up into the attic. There was nothing up there, obviously, apart from Robert the doll, sitting up in one of the chairs that Jean had made for him. I'm pretty sure Anne had left Robert locked in a chest and no one else had been up there since then, so that's a bit weird. But you know, a million reasonable explanations for how he is now sitting in a chair instead of being locked in a chest. The tenants had already broken one of the rules, going up into the attic, and so they weren't about to push their luck any further and start messing with Robert, so they just left him alone and went back downstairs. Only at some point after that, the noises in the attic started again. The giggling, the footsteps, bangs, furniture moving. Again, the tenants went back upstairs to check it out, to find that Robert now wasn't sitting in the chair that they had initially seen him in. He was now on the other side of the room. Okay, very disconcerting, but I guess at that point you can never rule out that it wasn't the other fella playing a prank on you and he moved Robert, you know? But there was another time when again the guys heard the attic noises. Again, they went upstairs. They saw nothing out of the ordinary going on other than Robert sitting where they had last seen him. And so they were just standing there just trying to figure out some rational explanation for all of these noises when they heard giggling right behind them. They obviously both span around trying to find the source of this giggling, but they couldn't see anything. When they turned back around, they noticed that Robert had moved across the room. While they were still in the attic, in a split second, he had somehow moved. That is a lot harder to explain away. One day they'd invited one of their mates over to the house, a guy called Malcolm Ross, and they'd said to him, "Oh Malcolm, do you want to see the doll?" So they took him to the room where Robert was, and according to Malcolm, he'd had this really strange sensation as soon as he entered. He said it felt like a metal bar running down his back. They got on to talking about Robert's backstory, and one of the tenants made a comment about what an old fool Jean must have been. Malcolm says at that moment he could have sworn that that he saw Robert's facial expression change, almost like he was angry at someone bad-mouthing Jean, which is very weird, and I don't believe that those two tenants stayed in the house much longer after that. Eventually, Anne Otto sold the artist's house to a close friend of hers called Bill Gazer, and there was a bit of a story surrounding Bill and his family too, because when Anne sold them the house, Robert was included in the sale. Bill had a 10-year-old daughter who immediately took to Robert. She really loved him, but one night she woke up to see that Robert was lying over her face, which absolutely terrified the young girl. She started screaming and wriggling to get Robert off her, and apparently even to this day she is adamant that Robert the doll was trying to smother her that night. After that night, she was obviously terrified of the doll, and so her dad, Bill, decided to lock him back up in the chest and put him away in the attic so that they could all just carry on with their lives. And this particular story goes on to say that it seems like Robert didn't like that and got the last laugh, as not long after he'd locked Robert away, Bill died from carbon monoxide poisoning from his car, which, if true, would be a bit uncanny, but it's not true. Bill very much survived his brush with Robert the doll, and he not long after went on to sell the artist house to his friends, William and Myrtle Reuter. Bill was recorded saying, however, that he wishes he had burned Robert the doll when he had the chance. Not because it was haunted or anything, but because it was a final representation of how Jean Otto had overshadowed Bill's good friend, Anne. But from the time that the Reuters moved into the artist house, Myrtle took on the role of caretaker for Robert the doll, and I assume she must have just had him out on display. He wasn't locked in a chest anymore. And again, like everyone else that's come into contact with him, things started out innocently enough. They did apparently hear the giggling and furniture shuffling about like the two tenants had heard, and in 1980 they sold the artist house and moved, but this time they didn't leave Robert behind. Myrtle took him with them. But then things started ramping up and getting a bit too much for Myrtle too. By 1994, allegedly the activity was just too much for the Reuters to handle. Robert was still seemingly moving about on his own, unexplained noises, all of that still going on, and so Myrtle donated him to the Fort East Martello Museum. According to museum staff, she hadn't wanted any money for him, it wasn't a loan, they just gave them Robert. She'd come to her wit's end, wanted nothing more to do with him. Allegedly, 3 months after this, Myrtle passed away, being only in her mid-50s, although I couldn't find a record of this. And so that's how Robert the doll ended up at the Fort East Martello Museum. But even though Robert was no longer in the artist's house, the potentially paranormal activity hadn't actually stopped, because it seems like the artist's house is haunted in its own right, Robert or no Robert. It's now operated as a B&B, so if you fancy it, you can stay in the same house where Robert the doll was for the majority of the 20th century. But guests will sometimes report seeing a female apparition, and she's usually walking down the stairs, or she's seen in the big back bedroom, which used to be Anne Otto's bedroom. Because I'm sure from the limited information I've given you about Jean and Anne's marriage, it will come as no shock to learn that they slept in separate bedrooms. And so a lot of people think that this female entity is Anne Otto, although others think it's Jean's mother Minnie. I'm inclined to believe that it is more likely to be Anne. I know she didn't have the happiest of marriages in that house, but if the affair rumours are true, neither did Minnie. She didn't even want to be buried with Jean's dad Thomas, so, you know. This female entity has been known to sometimes sit at the end of guests' beds in the middle of the night, and there was one woman who stayed in the B&B in 1996 who had just arrived. She'd just checked in, was just unpacking her things, when she saw this beautiful woman walking down the stairs in a long dress. This woman proceeded to walk through the guest before disappearing through a closed door. Obviously, the guest's mind was just well and truly boggled at what had just happened, but she said that she didn't feel scared. It was the furthest thing from a negative experience. She said that the apparition had a friendly, almost playful look about her. Elsewhere in the house, phones will apparently fly off the hook when no one is around, doors will swing open with no explanation, and funnily enough, if you find yourself in the attic, you may become overwhelmed with the dreadful sense that someone is watching you. One very interesting phenomenon that was first reported on the 25th of October 2003 was that multiple witnesses saw a blue orb. It appeared from the sky and dropped down before disappearing into the roof of the artist house. This orb was then seen floating around the house before going further down into the ground, which is a weird thing for multiple people to witness at the same time. But what makes it even weirder, the 25th of October was Jean Otto's birthday. Creepy! And this orb has apparently been seen since. I think it was last seen in October 2012, but by far the most notorious reports around this entire story story, of course, centre around Robert the Doll himself. Apparently, when Robert was first given to the museum by Myrtle Reuter, the staff was so terrified of the doll that they kept him locked away and covered by a sheet. If you wanted to see him, you had to make an appointment. The staff member booking the appointment would almost always try and book you on a day where they weren't working, so they wouldn't have to be in the same room as Robert. Because everyone in the community, they'd heard the stories around this doll, they were convinced he was haunted. They wanted as little to do with him as possible. Eventually though, ghost tours in the area were coming by the museum so frequently, asking to see Robert, that the museum decided he needed to go out on display. And so he was put on permanent display 2 years after arriving in 1996. But there are very strict rules that all visitors and staff must follow. The first rule is, you absolutely cannot make fun of Robert in any way. Don't insult his appearance, his clothes, his reputation, anything. Don't speak ill of him at all. Secondly, only address Robert by his full name. His name is Robert, or Robert the Doll, no nicknames. And finally, if you absolutely must take a photo of him, it's not generally encouraged by the museum, but if your visit to Key West would be incomplete without it, then you have to make sure that you respectfully ask permission before taking the photo. But Claire, why all the rules? What happens if you break the rules? Allegedly, some people who have broken these rules have gone on to have ridiculously bad luck, freak accidents, just twists and turns in their life that they never expected. Just like with Gene Otto, Robert is held responsible for anything that goes wrong after these people disrespect him. He's been blamed for car accidents, broken bones, job loss, divorces, disease, homelessness, drug addictions, even death. And all of these people report these terrible things happening to them after they've in some way slighted Robert the Doll. And because of that, Robert has received over 1,000 letters of apology. People begging for his forgiveness, to say sorry for disrespecting him, telling him all of the things that have happened to them since meeting him, and begging him to remove the curse from them. His caretaker at the museum, Corey Convertito, she estimates that Robert gets at least 1 to 3 letters every single day apologising for wronging him. Sometimes there are gifts of food, toys, and even sometimes money to sweeten the deal. And like I said at the start, someone actually paid for the display case that Robert now sits in. It seems like if you do decide that you want to meet him, it's best to just not take a photo of him, just be on the safe side. Depending on how much you believe in the whole story, of course. But there was one story of a visitor to the museum who says that they were very respectful of Robert. They asked his permission before taking a photo, they'd followed the rules, but when they'd gone home, their lip had swollen to like twice the size and they'd got rashes all over their arms. Sounds like an allergic reaction to something, but basically they didn't know where this reaction had come from, and so they immediately assumed that it was something to do with visiting Robert. They googled to see if they'd missed something, missed a rule, done anything that might have made Robert angry, but they couldn't see anything. As they were closing down all of the different tabs, they came across a blank one, so they clicked on it, and apparently all it said on this page was, "You didn't say where you were from." Is that another rule that Robert is introducing? Is it just a massive coincidence? Has the laptop been hacked and someone is playing a prank? Very weird. And I could go into so many more stories of what people have claimed has happened to them after visiting Robert, but there are literal Reddit threads that are full of what people say happened to them after their Robert encounter. So many stories, we would be here for hours. Basically just any type of bad luck you can think of, Robert has probably been held responsible for it. But there have been other weird encounters surrounding Robert the Doll during his time at the museum. In the late 90s, Robert was in need of some TLC, bit of restoration, and so he was taken out of his display case. They did the work, put him back, but apparently on the day he was returned, an employee said that he saw small, child-sized footprints in the dust on the floor. He was looking down, kind of following these footprints on the floor, when all of a sudden he heard tapping coming from the locked display case containing Robert. He looked over at Robert to notice that his feet were covered in dust. Very strange. Made even stranger when this employee, who it sounds like was completely alone in the room with Robert at the time, heard a single child's giggle, which he described as sounding very ominous. Not a cheerful little kid, almost like he was being taunted. That isn't the only weird thing to happen around Robert though. Apparently as soon as he was put out on display, the paranormal activity in the museum ramped up. I don't know if it was haunted before Robert. The tower that now houses the museum was built during the Civil War, and it was to defend Key West against an attack via the sea. So it dates back to like the 1860s, so maybe it could have been. There were no battles fought here though. But either way, after Robert arrived, weird things soon started happening. Doors would slam, lights would flicker, and apparently Robert has sometimes been known to throw his toy at museum staff. I'm assuming not like Leo just took a tumble from his lap and dropped to the floor, but the toy actually cleared some distance. The most common commonly reported phenomenon, though, is by far that cameras will malfunction when you try and take a photo. I guess maybe this is his way of telling you that you don't have permission, maybe? I don't really know. Some visitors have reported that the batteries in their digital cameras have completely drained around Robert, but as soon as they get outside, they turn on and they have full charge. Others that use one of those good old cameras where you have to use like a roll of film and go get it developed afterwards, they say that their entire roll of film with all of their holiday photos on will be ruined when they get the developed photos back, apart from the photos of Robert. And the weirdest report of all of them is that one guy claimed that when he developed his film, the only photos he received back were of Robert. 24 photos, in fact, of Robert the doll in different positions, which he's just chilling out in his display case. It is impossible for this guy to photograph Robert in different positions, but that's what he claimed happened. Robert's caretaker, Corey Convertito, she's not entirely convinced that there is anything going on with Robert. She says she doesn't really know, and that if there is anything going on with him or not, they seemingly have a decent working relationship. Robert allows her to get on with her job, checking him over to make sure he's not degrading, running his social media channels, the website, filing all of the letters, like all this sort of stuff. And if you decided that visiting Robert just wasn't enough for you, you can actually buy Robert the Doll merch from the museum. You can get books, coasters, t-shirts, all that good stuff. You can even buy a replica Robert the Doll. Although, I don't know, if there is anything going on with Robert the Doll, I feel like that is just tempting fate. And other people seem to share that opinion, as some have claimed that these replicas hold some of the same power that Robert does. But whatever really is going on with Robert the Doll, he remains one of the most famous dolls in the paranormal world. He was flown out to Las Vegas to be on the first episode of Zach Bagans' Deadly Possessions show, and even the great Ozzy Osbourne visited Robert when he was doing that show with his son Jack in Ozzy and Jack's World Detour, where they apparently had a minor bit of technical malfunction after asking Robert's permission to film him. And after that, Ozzy went on to fart in front of Robert the Doll, which I don't think started off a very respectful interaction between the two, because Jack then bought himself a replica of Robert, took it home, and that replica was apparently shot out of a water cannon. Ozzy picked up the doll, threw it on the ground and shouted, "Not him again." It was a whole thing. Reality TV, am I right? But afterwards, Ozzy Osbourne went on to say that he is 100% a believer in Robert the Doll now, and he absolutely, without a doubt, believes that what he did to Robert and the replica Robert are the reason that he has been suffering with health problems since 2019. Outside of TV, it said that Robert the Doll was the inspiration behind the Child's Play franchise, which, of course, is centered around an evil doll called Chucky, who started wreaking havoc on the world after a voodoo ritual. Is it bad to say that I've never seen any of the Child's Play movies? I feel like that is a horror rite of passage, and up until now, I've just never sat down and watched any of them. I feel like that needs to change. Or does it? Let me know, are they worth the watch? But Robert the Doll, he also has his own claim to movie stardom. After a horror franchise that is loosely based on Robert went on to have something like 5 movies all based on him. And so if you're in the Key West area and you're into the paranormal, visiting Robert the Doll at the Fort East Martello Museum might seem like a non-negotiable activity to tick off a staple on the paranormal bucket list. But whether or not you decide to take a souvenir home with you, or even snap a photo to commemorate the occasion, well, that's at your own risk. So what do you think? Is Robert the Doll all-seeing, all-knowing, demanding respect, or suffer the consequences? I don't know what to think, to be honest, but I would absolutely err on the side of caution with this one, just in case. Even David Sloan, the guy who wrote the most comprehensive and, from what I can see, accurate book on Robert the Doll, he went on to say that in the process of writing the book, he lost 4 hard drives, and each time the Apple technicians could recover everything but the book manuscript. Mediums told him that Robert would give him cancer if he didn't like the book, and apparently he's also gone through various levels of possession in the course of writing this book, which all sounds very heavy, but again, is it more imagination? You've heard the stories, so many people who claim to have been cursed by whatever power Robert the Doll has, the letters of apology begging them for their normal life back, people regretting ever even visiting him. But could it be, at least in some cases maybe, let's say, that it's just confirmation bias? That people know Robert the Doll's reputation, they know bad things happen to people who get on the wrong side of him, and so they visit, and then lo and behold, bad things start happening to them afterwards. And so they immediately assume that they've been cursed by Robert too. It's the same thing as Gene Otto blaming Robert for everything again, isn't it? Forgetting the fact that people go through horrifically terrible luck every single day, and that maybe these terrible things were inevitably going to happen to them, and it just so happened that they visited Robert before they did. I don't know, and I want to know what you think. 4 hard drives where the book is the only thing that can't be recovered. That is super weird. And so I am erring on the side of caution. I hope I have done this story justice. I have been as respectful as I can be, and hopefully, Robert, you don't mind me telling your story to all of these lovely people watching right now. But please, as always, let me know what you think about Robert the Doll in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this video, let me know by leaving it a little like and maybe subscribe if you haven't already. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Robert Eugene Otto was born in 1990. He was born in 1990? I don't think he was.